Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, a TMC E120 vlog presented by myself, Mary Sparacino. This novel begins with the death of a Mr. Dashwood. Upon his death, John Dashwood, his son from his first marriage, receives all of his inheritance, leaving his second wife, Mrs. Dashwood, and their children, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, with almost nothing. With great timing, a letter arrives from Mrs. Dashwood from Sir John Middleton, a distant relative. He offers her and her daughters his own cottage from Barton Park. Mrs. Dashwood gladly accepts his offer, although her oldest daughter, Eleanor, is saddened to have to say goodbye to her love, Edward. Soon after their move from Norland to Barton Park, they meet Sir John Middleton, his wife, Lady Middleton, her mother, Mrs. Jennings, and a bachelor, Colonel Brandon. Next thing you know, while running around outside, Marianne comes to a great fall and sprains her ankle. Not to worry, a handsome stranger comes to her rescue. He picks her up and takes her back home. John Willoughby was his name, and Marianne continued to grow closer to him. They are practically a couple, and people begin to wonder about an engagement between the two of them. However, Mr. Willoughby makes his leave to London, and Marianne is deeply saddened. She misses him terribly and pretty much mopes around the house for a while, showing that she truly loved him. It is then that we are introduced to Miss Lucy and Anne Steele. In fact, Lucy confides in Eleanor about her love for Edward, and explains to her that they have actually been engaged for 4 years now, having to keep it a secret so that he won't lose his inheritance from his mother. Much to her happiness, Marianne is able to travel with her sister Eleanor and Mrs. Jennings to London. After some time of not hearing back or seeing John Willoughby, she finally is able to address him, and he completely disregards her. She later finds out that he is in fact engaged to another woman, a Miss Sophia Grey. Besides obviously being hurt from this news, she is extremely upset that he could do such a thing, and naturally her sister Eleanor takes her side. Next, Lucy's older sister accidentally spills the beans of her sister's engagement to Edward. Edward's mother is furious and ends up giving the inheritance to his brother Robert. It is during a stay with family friends in Cleveland that Marianne gets sick. Not only is she mentally sick from finding out that her love is going to marry another woman, but she has been out in the cold rain, making her deathly ill. Upon hearing the news of Marianne's sickness, John Willoughby tries to visit and explain what happened. Simply put, he married Sophia Grey for her money, and although he truly loved Marianne. Colonel Brandon, being the gentleman that he is, offers to ride with Mrs. Dashwood to see Marianne in her extreme sickness. It is during this time of travel between the two of them that Colonel Brandon ends up confessing his love for Marianne. Finally, the Dashwoods return home, all being good and well, and then they are told from their servant that Lucy Steele and Mr. Ferrars are engaged, although it's Eleanor that is in love with a man who seems to be engaged to another woman. She is surprisingly calm, although clearly disappointed. Her sister Marianne, however, is quite the opposite of calm and goes into hysterics. But not to fear, it turns out to be the other Mr. Ferrars, Robert, that is engaged to Lucy. Edward himself corrects Eleanor's misconception, explaining that Lucy decided to marry Robert after he was the one who received the inheritance. And being the free man that he was, Edward proposed to his love Eleanor, and they were happily married. And it wasn't long until Edward and Eleanor purposefully invited over Colonel Brandon and Marianne to their house, and often. Before you know it, the two were married, and all four of them lived together, finishing off the story with a happy ending. Now that the summary of the novel has been told, let's better explain the characters. Henry Dashwood was married to Mrs. Dashwood, his second wife at the time he died, and left behind 3 children with her, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret. However, it was his son, John Dashwood, from his first wife, who received all of the inheritance. Being greedy, John kept the money mostly to himself and his equally selfish wife, Fanny. It was Sir John Middleton, a relative, that offered his cottage to Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters. He was also so happy, sweet, and inviting towards other people, and always with him and equally jolly was his wife, Lady Middleton, and her mother, Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Jennings did, however, have another daughter, Mrs. Palmer, who was silly, jolly, and married to Mr. Palmer, who was completely serious and nothing at all like her. Edward was Eleanor's love interest from their home in Norland, and his brother was Robert, the one who ended up getting the inheritance at the end of the story and marrying Edward's ex-secret fiancée Lucy, sister of Miss Anne Steele. Colonel Brandon was the first bachelor that the girls met in Barton Park, and being the good guy, he ended up getting his girl Marianne. However, it was John Willoughby who was the handsome stranger who helped Marianne when she tripped near her home near Barton Park, fell in love with her, but ended up marrying Sophia Gray in the end for her money. Lastly, I'd like to talk about a few various elements of the novel in regards to the character. The setting first takes place with the Dashwoods settled in Norland, but they moved to Barton Park and later traveled to London and Cleveland. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that Eleanor is a static, unchanging character, while Marianne can be seen as a dynamic character through her change of heart. She is also a sympathetic character. I was happy with the thought of Marianne and John Willoughby together, and I sympathized with her when her heart was broken, learning that he was to marry someone else. Both Marianne and Eleanor had a complication in the story. Eleanor's was the fact of her love secretly engaged to someone else, while Marianne's came after she was happy with John when he simply left her for another woman. There was a reversal at that point. Marianne no longer had John all to herself. She was left alone until she was slowly pushed towards Colonel Brandon. Although Eleanor did not have a reversal, she had an epiphany when Edward came to explain that it was his brother that married Lucy. Thanks to Jane Austen for the equilibrium ending, everyone seems to be happily married off, living happily ever after. The end.